And before we start the third panel, we're going to have a few words from Shala Ahmed to speak about her brother and context for her. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from lunch. It's actually been an absolutely amazing and fascinating day for me here so far, and I thank you all very much for this. I'm a gynecologist, and so completely out of my field, and it's been fascinating for me to see how these meetings operate, because literally a week ago today, I was sitting in a menopause meeting, which was very prescriptive, very didactic. You're allowed to ask questions and get answers, but please do not discuss anything, because we are the experts and we know it all. So to hear the discourse that's gone on today has been wonderful for me from all perspectives. So thank you very much for the invitation. Yossi called me after 20 years and said, we're running this day, and could we speak about your brother in the context of him being Muslim? And how he related to Islam and what his thoughts were on Islam and his general views on Islam. And I nearly replied to Yossi in the same context that my brother replied to me when I said, could you give a speech at my wedding, and this is what I'd like you to say, which is, why don't you do the speech? But actually I've managed to the first thought that came into my mind, and the reason I was so terrified of having to speak today, was the first thing that came into my mind was based on a conversation I had with my brother about a decade ago. And I don't even remember what the conversation actually was, but he said to me, Charlotte, the trouble with you, and this really is the trouble with you, is that you know very little, you haven't read the Quran, you haven't understood it, and neither have you read very much about Islam either, so I don't know where you're coming from. But if there ever was a religion worth following, Islam would be it. So he was very much, within that spirit of Islam for his life, really. He was born into a Muslim family, that's us, in Singapore, and he was born at Mount Alvernia Hospital, which is a hospital run by nuns. So within hours of his birth, Mother Superior whisked him off to the chapel, had him sprinkled with holy water, baptized, whatever, and came back and presented him to my parents, who were quite laid back about the whole thing, because within those few hours, obviously, my father had whispered the adhan into his ears. So my brother, within a few hours of his life, was introduced to comparative religion. And I think this has been the theme of his life ever since then. We grew up in Singapore, which at the time was a very beautiful society. There was a huge mix of ethnicities, of languages which were spoken, of the best food in the world, of all varieties, and of a deep mutual religious and cultural respect for everybody else. We celebrated everything. The Singaporean government was great. You got a holiday for Diwali, for Eid, for Christmas, for Chinese New Year, and everything was celebrated with gusto, with feasting, with enjoyment, and with very much an understanding of what the mutual society around you was. And in a sense, that is a very Islamic way, if you want to look at it in that context, to be brought up. And the dedication right in the front of the book, which is to my parents, is he thanks them for bringing them up in the cosmopolitan of their Islam and the Islam of cosmopolitanism. And that is very much how we grew up and how he lived his life. My mother, he was her adored golden child. And she loved him very much, and I think for the most part of his life, in the true Islamic sense, he felt that heaven was at the feet of his mother, and then he got married. But she very much encouraged him and nurtured him in a very non-traditional South Asian fashion. She understood that this boy was not going to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, chartered accountant, but that his love was something different. And she and my grandmother nurtured and supported his passion for history, for art, and for reading. And here I will just tell you a little story. When Mum used to take us to the National Library in Singapore about once a week, and my brother was quite little at the time, and one day he went up to the librarian and said, I want to become a member of the library. And she said to him, but you're very little, how old are you? He was 4 years old. But can you read? He said, of course I can read. So she said, all right, go and find a book, bring it back to me, read the book, and let's see where we go from here. So he returned with this treatise on fish and sat down and read it to her, cover to cover. and we left the library with him having attained membership as the youngest member of the National Library of Singapore. What that poor librarian did not realise is that he had memorised the book, and he was turning the pages, as some children do, at exactly the right moment. So he had a prodigious memory, a voracious appetite for reading, and I think that's very much what allowed his early steps and progression to the professorial chair. He was schooled in Singapore. He started off, and again, there was this, how we grew up in Singapore. Both of us went to a British primary school, which was kind of Church of England, but not really, and that explained his cut-glass accent. He then went to the Anglo-Chinese school, which was a Methodist institution, and the school motto, I think, was very close to his heart, and he did carry it with him through his life. He then went on to Caterham School in Surrey over here, where he royally failed all his A-levels and most of his O-levels, before going on to score get amazing SAT scores and go on to the American University in Cairo, and then Princeton, and then Harvard. So I think that just says something for the education system before he actually flourished. He obtained caps and colours for hockey, for cricket, for badminton, and he was also the captain of his debating team, and I don't think anyone would be surprised to hear that. And I have, as many others have probably, been held to ransom more than once in seemingly simple conversations with him. But really, like most teenagers, he also had a series of posters on his wall, but this was one he carried with him for most of his life, and I think that very much describes the person that he was. He had Thoreau, he had Ralph Waldo Emerson, and amazingly, he also had the hymn Amazing Grace on his wall. And I remember looking at it and thinking, what a strange combination of things, but he was a strange combination of things, as I think you will probably have realised in reading his book. He was very much an individualist, very individual thinker, and as people have used the word eccentric, I can't deny that he was. At the age of 18, he came back to Malaysia and he presented a paper at a conference, and this was duly reported in the Malaysian press. And can I just quote something to you here, because it, I think, actually seeds what this book is about. He says that about the greatest misconception of Islam made by non-Muslims and Muslims alike is to understand it as a religion purely of spiritual aspects of life. And he also says it extends and influences all aspects of existence, whether spiritual, rational, scientific, or social. And it cannot and does not confine itself solely to spiritual matters, and thus there is no profane and sacred worlds in religion. This he was saying at the age of 18, this he's written about and published at the age of 48. He was very, very taken with beauty, and beauty was a very important part of his life. And this is a picture of him contemplating a gorgeous view in Trinidad. Whether there's a bikini-clad body on the end of the beach, I have no idea. But certainly his love for beauty was expressed in many, many ways. He had an amazing collection of carpets. He collected artifacts. He took me around Egypt once, actually. We both decided to have a little holiday together, and he was my personal guide. And I think I had gained more of an insight of Islamic Egypt in that 1 week than I could ever have done in any other way, where he delighted in showing me details on tiles and various other frescoes and all sorts of things. And while we were going around together, we would go into shops and he would talk to them in Arabic, and we would converse either in Urdu or Malay, and the shopkeepers would get very, very confused by this. And then someone said to us, well, what is your relationship? And he said, well, we're brother and sister. And they said, well, you're dark. He said to him, you're fair, she's dark, you speak Arabic, she doesn't speak Arabic, how can you be brother and sister? And they came to the perfect Islamic solution for this, which was same father, different mother. And so we carried this through for the rest of our trip, and it worked perfectly. Shahab, as you know, had a fondness for many things, cats and wine. And he on one trip, this was taken when he came to stay with us a couple of years ago in a bottle shop in Islington, where this cat just climbed up and decided to deposit itself on his shoulders, and we nearly had to take it home with us. We did take some wine home with us, but left the cat behind. And he felt he was very much in good company with Jahangir, with Raleigh, and with other writers that he adored in his appreciation of wine. And his timing was always impeccable because I remember being up to my elbows in deshelling prawns or something hideous like that. And he arrived home with this bottle and said, I had bought this amazing Turkish wine and I needed a canter. And then was utterly mortified when I handed him a Pyrex jug. But it did work extremely well, and it was surprisingly good wine. Which brings me back, really, to the beginning and what today is all about. And it is about, in a sense, a legacy, a work which is a springboard from which I hope a lot else progresses. And I think Shahab would very much have appreciated the discourse and the dichotomy of views that have been expressed today. When he was about 6 years old, he said to my mother, Mum, and this is something she told me recently, everyone has a little bit of God in them. I know that. And when they die, that little bit of God goes back to God, expressing something quite spiritual at a very young age, and also probably the first law of physics. But, for everyone here in this room today who still has their God particle intact, thank you very much for being here and for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thanks so much. Good. My name is Chris Moffat. I'm lecturer in South Asian history here at Queen Mary, and I have the privilege to chair this third panel on private and public law and politics. And I thought I'd just introduce our three speakers and then invite them up one by one. Our first speaker will be Rob Gleave, who is the professor of Arabic Studies and director of the Center for the Study of Islam at the University of Exeter. And Professor Gleave is specifically interested in Islamic legal theory, particularly legal hermeneutics, and the history of Shiite legal thought and institutions. Our second speaker will be Nafeh Chowdhury, who is a PhD student at the Dickson Poon School of Law at King's College London. And Nafeh is interested in questions of law and development, the rule of law, legal pluralism, and Islamic law and society, particularly in South and Central Asia. And then our third speaker will be Humaira Iftidar, who is senior lecturer in politics at King's College London. And Humaira works in areas of Islamic political thought and comparative political theory, and is interested in exploring the relationship between state and market in political imaginations and the subsequent relationship with Islamic thought and practice. So I think we have a really rich grouping of speakers for this panel. Without further ado, I'll invite Rob down to start us off.
Okay, well, hello everybody, and thank you very much to Yossi and his team for putting together such an interesting paper. And it's been difficult following the sister of Shahab Ahmed, actually, because, well, I don't know how she feels, but I feel a little bit uncomfortable, invite all these academics together and they're all going to nitpick his book and say what they don't like about it. And of course, the things which are positive about the book, we're all going to take as read. So please take as read the fact that it is an incredible piece of erudition and the breadth of learning and sources and understanding and observations. On every page you find something new you didn't know before and something which prompts you to think things through in a little bit of a different way. And so from that point, it's a right rollicking read. And that is, I think, what you can't say that about many academic books, let's put it that way. So I would say that take all that as read, but I want to talk a little bit about what the influence or what the potential influence is of what Shahab Ahmed says in his book for the study of Islamic law. So I feel in some ways that the general thesis of the book is something which we've been working within the field on for quite some time now. I think that we're sort of, some of the fights which he has in the book are with people like 20, 25 years ago, and the field has moved on a little bit. So that's not a bad thing to do, because some people are still using those texts for teaching undergraduates and what have you. So these are battles worth fighting. But in terms of where the field goes from here, we have sort of taken on board. And I think that I've tried to do that myself in the projects which I've had. For example, my legitimate and illegitimate violence project published a volume with Edinburgh University Press, and 2 others are to come out. And really, we looked at violence in Islamic thought, and it wasn't purely about law. We understood Islamic thought as encompassing poetry and literature and art and architecture, and that we understood Islamic thought in this broader sense. And in a sense, that project chimed with a lot of what Shahab Ahmed is trying to achieve in this book. If we look specifically about what he says about law, as Shuruk said earlier, I mean, law's the bad guy in this particular drama, and so is primarily a large chunk of the book is used to looking at the way in which scholars. So the direction of his criticism is sometimes at scholars of Islamic law, and sometimes it's at Muslim legal scholars, if you understand the difference. And he doesn't always distinguish between the two, but these are clearly 2 targets which he's trying to fire at in different parts of the book. So let's, dealing first of all, I think probably in order, is that he believes that Western scholars have overemphasized law as a central discipline in Islam. And law is the sort of archetypal text with a capital T, although it's not always capitalized. For someone who loved italics so much, he didn't like capital letters as much. Which was, he really loved his italics, So, Western scholars have overemphasized law as the central and defining discipline of what is and what is not Islamic. This is what he calls the legal supremacist argument. But it's not just law. It's a particular vision of law, which he identifies with the fuqaha jurisprudence. And this has meant that other forms of normativity, as he sees them, are viewed as not properly Islamic. And that somehow they're secondary. I think as a field, and he has a large section, as you will all know, on the law of the Sultan, and how this should be treated as Islamic law alongside what the fuqaha say is Islamic law. I think as a field we've sort of accepted that argument some time ago. So it's entertaining and certainly occasionally acerbic in its commentary on contemporary scholarship, but I'm not sure if it changes anything per se for the legal field. I think in his final section of his book, the saddest bit of all of this textualism is that the Muslims have bought it in the modern period. They've bought the Orientalist narrative about the primacy of law. And they've been fooled into thinking that this is their heritage. And this for him is a source of, you can tell, reading between the lines, and sometimes you don't need to read between the lines. This is a source of enormous anguish for him almost, disappointment if you like, with the way in which Muslims have reacted to colonization and the way in which they've reacted to modernity in its broader sense. So that is a rather whistle-top tour of what I think his main argument concerning law is. And I'm brought up in a preaching tradition. I'm going to say 3 things about 3 problems which come out of this particular thesis. First of all, his criticisms of Western scholars are sometimes, I think, rather harsh, in the sense that I don't think they're trying to say what he thinks they're trying to say, if that makes sense. I got the impression reading that section of the book, I can just imagine him going to the Widener Library, getting out a book one day, feeling really angry about it and going home and writing 1,000 words. Next day, he goes to the library, he gets another book off the shelf, he feels really angry about it and he writes another 1,000 words. And this happens again and again and again, and he strings it together for a 50-page critique, if you like, of the way in which Islamic legal studies has developed in the recent past, or Islamic studies more generally. But there are occasions when I think that the scholars which he's reading don't quite say what he wants to, and it doesn't quite fit into his thesis. So, for example, page 453, you see we're already in context here. This is the text, and we're looking at context now. Page 53, for those of you. He says, halfway down, this being, it ought by now to be patently clear that we should discard for once and for all the impoverished legal supremacist conceptual habit that stubbornly insists that, and then he quotes Bob Johansen, the respect for normative pluralism, ikhtilaf, is possible only because the fiqh scholars conceive an ontological difference between the knowledge as revealed by God in Quranic texts, the Prophet's practice and community consensus on the one hand, and the knowledge which human beings acquire through their own reasoning. So he's saying that we can get rid of that distinction. Because he wants to say that Islamic normativity is varied, and that it's not limited to, and it's not explained by this distinction. But of course that's not what Bobby Johansen's saying at all. What Bobby Johansen is saying is that ikhtilaf within the juristic mode of discourse is the mechanism whereby you can create legal pluralism within a single system. He's not saying that the difference between human reason and scriptural interpretation is why wine drinking is suddenly permitted, or that what the Sufis do is somehow acceptable. That's not what he's saying at all. But Shahab Ahmed wants him to say that. So he then has a footnote which says, to be more than fair to Johansen, he makes this statement in the context of an essay on the Muslim fiqh as sacred law. Nonetheless, as is typical of scholars of Islamic law, he associates Islamic normativeness solely with Sharia. That's not quite what Bobby Johansen is saying in that article. So I think it's a bit cheeky to put that in the text and then make the claim as if that's the explanatory element, and that's the failure, if you like, of Islamic legal studies, because Bobby Johansen was making a very specific point about ikhtilaf within the legal sphere, not ikhtilaf within human society generally. Another example, a scholar who I know reasonably well, Norman Calder. At one point he cites Norman Calder and he says, Norman Calder also seeks to broaden the concept of Islam in his article, The Limits of Islamic Orthodoxy. It is, quoting Calder, it is possible to propose that the whole intellectual tradition of Sunni Islam can be encapsulated in a list of literary genres, these being the genres, the tradition of writing through which Sunni community has given expression to its understanding of its relationship to God and his Prophet. The complete list, and I emphasize that I am referring here specifically to Sunni community, is as follows: Qisas al-Anbiya, Sirat al-Nabi, Quran, Hadith, Fiqh, Kalam, Tafsir, Shar al-Hadith. Back to Shahab Ahmed. Glaringly absent from Calder's expansive gesture, and thus from the ambit of Islamic orthodoxy that is for him the truly Islamic, are Sufism, philosophy, and any trace of literary discourse of adab. Calder was saying these are the constitutive elements of Sunni Islam, not Islam. That is, that if you want to construct Sunni Islam, the specifically Sunni identity, these are the genres which define it. Other genres may be contributing to Islam generally, but they don't contribute to the definition of Sunni Islam. And Shahab Ahmed's slippage, if you like, between Islam and Sunni Islam is one of the major problems I have with the book. I think in some ways it's a deeply sectarian book, in that his notion of Islam is always imbued with a notion of what Sunni Islam is. This is, of course, Rob Gleave talking about Shiism again. So, but it's not just the Shi'i vision, but it's other visions as well, which I think are underplayed and not developed within the book. And the diverse understandings of Islam that come from these different traditions within Islam are not incorporated into this notion of what is and is not Islamic. As well as that, the legal supremacist trap and what he calls on page 455 the usul al-fiqh jurisprudence that proceeds from it. For those of us that work in the area of Islamic law, this is a really unsophisticated way of understanding the relationship between usul al-fiqh and practice of fiqh, or practice of law within court. It's not as if we have a simple causative mechanism whereby all of these things can be lumped together in a single thing. Under Shihab Ahmed's categorization, usul al-fiqh is pretext. A lot of usul al-fiqh is pretext, in that it talks about the fundamental reason why we should treat these texts as authoritative. It's something which is outside, if you like, of textual hermeneutics, just focusing on the text. It's actually saying, why should we even listen to prophets? Why should we take the Quran seriously at all? And usul al-fiqh, from my perspective, is pretext, and yet he lumps them together within the jurists' lexicon, or the code that he has for these people that he believes have sort of distracted Western Orientalists to think that that's what Islam is. And missing from his book, I think, is some of the self-critical notions we have about the term Islamic law, which at no point in the book does he problematize. He takes it as Islamic law is this, or people think that Islamic law is that, but he never investigates the term Islamic law. Missing from his bibliography is a really fundamental article about this, Baudouin Duprey's article, What is Islamic Law?, in which he says that Islamic law, the term Islamic law, or in any of the European language, is a construct that Western European scholars have invented, and which Muslim reformers have also used and maybe invented themselves in order to control the discourse around the relationship between Islam and politics. That Islamic law is not a concept which you would find within the Islamic legal tradition, not within the Sultan's law and not within the fiqh tradition. It's an invented category, a modern invented category, Islamic law. You think we know what it means? It has no Arabic equivalent. Something like Al-Qanun al-Islami is quite obviously a calque. It's not an indigenous term. And I think that, in a certain sense, that would have helped Shihab Ahmed's argument. I think he would have been able to use that in order to develop some of the things he wants to say. I think it would have benefited from that. So usul, like philosophy and Sufism, is actually pretext, I would say. But he lumps it in with the jurisprudence. And finally, he seems to treat the fuqaha jurisprudence as a single class of society. Throughout the whole book, he acts as if this is what they do and this is the only thing they do. But the fuqaha jurisprudence, they were Sufis, they were philosophers, they were working in all sorts of disciplines at the same time. And that those disciplines influenced the way in which they did fiqh, and the way in which they did fiqh influenced those disciplines. This seems to me not necessarily very helpful to understand the complexity of intellectual figures in the pre-modern period. So, his disenchantment with the modern is because they have taken on the one element of the classical civilization. He wouldn't want to use those terms, but for want of a better term, we could refer to it. One element of the pre-modern intellectual universe which he explores in the book has been taken over by the modern period. And his disenchantment with the modern is, for me, a bit pessimistic. One of the things I've learned by studying more and more contemporary discussion around these central issues is that actually it's quite an exciting place to be. There is quite a lot of interesting stuff going on. There are people who are pushing the boundaries. Even in the very tradition which he feels is so negative, even within what you might call the Wahhabi Salafi tradition, there are interesting debates going on, really thoughtful debates going on. These are not ignorant literalists we're talking about. Although I wrote in a book on why literalists aren't ignorant, but these are not ignorant literalists who are unable to think about matters. They are really sophisticated thinkers. They just believe certain things about texts which may be at variance with Shihab Ahmed's. And I think, in a sense, the book as a whole is a product of Wahhabism. I don't think he could have written this book without Wahhabism. I think Wahhabism inspired him to write this book. And I think he's influenced by Wahhabi ideas and the Wahhabi mode of organization when he writes this book. He just has a different notion of what the response is to modernity. By admitting the paradox in these 6 things at the beginning of the book, he's bought the Wahhabi argument that these are paradoxical. That's what I think. He's bought the Wahhabi argument that there is a contradiction between wine drinking and the fiqh. He's overvalued the fiqh when he's bought that. Whereas the pre-modern period, you don't find these as paradoxes. You don't find people obsessing about them in the same way. You have an acceptance of diversity, which he recognizes in the book and emphasizes, but his promotion of these as paradoxes is a modern promotion. And that's partly why I have a few problems with the methodological structure of the book. I think it's a marvelous and entertaining read. And I'm sure he was an extremely engaging person to have an intellectual exchange with. That I have no doubt about, and that shines through from the book. And that's part of the reason why he's inspired me to think deeper about these things. Thank you.
Nafi Chaudhry? You don't have a...
No. Okay, so thank you all very much for being here today, and particularly thank you to Professor Yossi Rappaport for contacting me early on about speaking on Shahab's book from a legal perspective. And thank you, Dr. Chris Moffat, for the very kind introduction. So I'm coming to Shahab's book from a legal background, and in particular, my area of research and interest is in law and society, or socio-legal studies. And in a nutshell, what socio-legal studies is about is decentering prevailing approaches to the law. And so when we understand the law, often the idea of courts, judges, enactments come to mind, which often trace back to the authority of the state. And what law and society scholarship does is make the interjection that law doesn't always govern people's lives the way the law thinks it does. Rather, law is interconnected with a variety of other forms of other forces that control human behavior, such as politics, ethics, religion, and otherwise. And thus, socio-legal scholarship is concerned with closing this distance between law and social reality, since legal authority intertwines with other forms of authority in the real world. And so, in reading What is Islam, I'm particularly interested in understanding what insights Shahab's book can provide to the discipline of law, not just Islamic law, but law in society more broadly. And maybe I'll have some provocative interpretations, which we can discuss. So, as you know from the book, the objective of Shahab's writing was to provide a definition of Islam, which was attuned to the historical human phenomenon of the religion of Islam. I'm not going to say the religion of Islam, and which is punctuated with all of these contradictions. And then by the end of the book, he reaches his definition of hermeneutic engagement, which takes into account text, pretext, and context. Now, before he actually arrives there, he takes stock at the prevailing conceptualizations, and it begins off with law, which we just went through. And the way I'm going to structure my speech is in 2 parts. First, I'm just going to review this taking stock that Shahab does of the equating Islam equals Islamic law or Islamic equals Sharia. And then I'm going to use that as a point of dialogue with law and society or the legal domain, because this is a way of creating a certain bridge as I see it. And so, as Professor Gleave mentioned, he spends about 60 pages or so really saying how there's a problem in this equating of Islam to Islamic law. And this is how prevailing scholarship generally often treats the matter. So Shahab states that the default position amongst scholars of Islam is to give primacy to the legal discourse as constituting the normative content of Islam. And he cites a number of scholars, Wael Halak, Meshek Brinkley, and others. And here I'll just very briefly cite some of these interlocutors and the way that they've looked at Islamic law. So it is the very essence or core kernel of Islam. It is a legal blueprint of social order. It is a total discourse wherein all institutions find simultaneous expression, be they religious, legal, moral, or economic. And in this last definition, you really see the thrust of the argument. Islamic law is viewed as a totalizing discourse, and thus Islam becomes a legal construct, and its contents and boundaries, and here I'll quote Shahab, end up being defined and constituted by in a cult of regulation, restriction, and control. And so the progression of his argument is as follows. According to many scholars, Islam equals Islamic law, and secondly, Islamic law is confined to restrictions and controls because that's the nature of law. And so the result is, finally, 3, the normative content of Islam can be understood as these restrictions and controls. And one can see why there would be some widespread appeal. I mean, just in layman terms, when we ask, is such and such an activity Islamic? What, drinking, smoking, wearing Armani glasses? Often the point of reference ends up being is the Sharia. And so determining if something is Islamic or not becomes a question of fiqh, or Islamic positive law. Now, for Shahab, and Professor Deeb mentioned this is a rather impoverished way of viewing the law. And there's 2 reasons why. First, if we understand Islam strictly through a legal lens, it greatly diminishes the normative value of other competing non-legal traditions, Sufism, literature, philosophy, otherwise. And so Islam as a historical phenomenon was marked by these internal contradictions which often went against the Sharia, and the case of Muslim wine drinkers, which runs throughout his book, is a clear example. And so to understand this diversity of human experience and the way Muslims constructed the reality as Muslims requires an understanding that goes beyond simply law. And the second critique would be that Shah emphasizes that in the pre-modern world, law actually ended up playing a very marginal, or at least not as prominent a role as we find in the present. The primacy of law in our modern societies, for Muslim and non-Muslim, it stems from the relatively recent rise of nation states. The modern nation state is legitimized by law and operates through law, since law helps create categories and norms that can be widely distributed. And this is why Shahab mentions the primacy of law as a form of Muslim modernity rather than a historically informed understanding of the religion. So now, having reviewed briefly Shahab's critique, now I'll use it as a point of departure to explore how law is viewed in socio-legal scholarship, my area of comfort. And so Shahab's discomfort with the primacy of law to the detriment of other discourses, it resonates within legal scholarship. Because one persistent question in legal scholarship is the extent to which you can draw a line between the law and the social. And this is how the reasoning goes. Legal ideas have a certain privilege in society, since they're viewed as constitutive of behavior in the way that other disciplines can't claim. At least this is the argument. And here I'm borrowing the ideas of Professor David Nelkin, who's written about the so-called truth of law's truth. Law has a unique way of interpreting the world. Law as a discourse in society is able to absorb information and then re-engineer it through its own legal processes. As humans, we're fundamentally meaning-seeking individuals, and law provides us the framework through which we give meaning to human experience. Furthermore, these legal frameworks have a certain hegemonic or magnetic pull towards themselves, making it very difficult to generally operate outside of them. Now, I can take this point a bit further, and here I'm going to make a slightly stronger claim, and that is modern society can be seen one that is produced by law. And I mentioned a bit earlier how the modern nation state has a monopoly over law and the force of law, and that's how it legitimizes its behavior. And that's true, but I'm saying something a bit different here. Here I'm saying that law produces its own understanding of its normative environment. And this means that 2 things are happening. First, law delineates the categories through which we see the world. So this means that it provides the slots into which we place information so that we can make sense of what's around us. Secondly, law provides us an understanding of inclusion and exclusion. And so when we're presented with this information, this process of figuring out whether that information fits into one slot or another is fundamentally a legal process. Now, following this line of reasoning, the reality of the world around us ends up being produced in the image of law. Thus, and here comes the punchline, law constitutes social reality. Now, as a consequence, the line between the legal and the social becomes greatly blurred. So how then did, in this discussion, we get from law being rules and regulations to law all the way ending up constituting social reality? And the answer is, it's a function of how I defined law in my discussion. I've defined it in such a way that I recognize law as rules and constraints, but I also give prominence to the processes that it sets into play. Hence, the way law is defined has a significant bearing on the discussions that follow therefrom. So now we can turn back to Shahab's question, whether law may constitute the core kernel of Islam. And this provocation introduces the other highly intriguing question, namely, what is law, or what is Islamic law? And a clear definition of Islamic law, and Professor Gleave touched on this as well, can provide insights into the way Islamic law and Islam as concepts or categories converge or diverge from one another. Now, for some, this might seem like a bit of an unfair critique or comment on his work, because his work wasn't about defining Islamic law. Rather, it was to destabilize the stranglehold that Islamic law had over the conception of Islam. However, since Shahab so painstakingly emphasizes the significance of defining our terms carefully so that we know what we're talking about, it does seem fair to ask, what is Islamic law? And so at least we know one thing, and that is the negative, what Islamic law is not. And Islamic law is not the full content of Islam, because that's the argument that he's trying to argue. Beyond that, he doesn't provide a clear definition. However, he does refer to Islamic law as regulations, restriction, and control. Now, I'm certainly not going to say that this is how he would have defined Islamic law, but since it derives from his text, I'm going to go with it for the sake of the argument. This definition of Islamic law as regulation, restriction, and control contrasts to the approach of his interlocutors, who accept more expansive definitions. For example, I mentioned one of the interlocutors, Messick Brinkley, who viewed Islamic law as finding expression in religious, legal, moral, and economic institutions. This definition of law resembles those socio-legal scholars who view law as constituting legal reality, where the line between the law and these other categories become blurred. However, if we remain faithful, on the other hand, to the more limited definition of law as restrictions, regulations, and control, then the boundaries between law and these other categories remain more clearly defined. And so the point I'm making here is a rather subtle one, because what I'm saying is that the category of Islamic law that's the object of Shahab's critique may be differently constructed for him and his interlocutors. His interlocutors may be quite okay with a more expansive definition, where law becomes a part of other social processes and discourses. And consequently, if these processes produce contradictory human and historical practices, it doesn't really deter from the centrality of law to Islam. Now, I've spent a few minutes critiquing this definition of Islamic law that I've extracted from Shahab's text. But I can now do the opposite, because there are actual strengths to defining law in a way that represents it as regulations, restrictions, and control. What Shahab is calling for throughout his book is greater clarity in the terms we use. For example, if we define terms like Islam, law, culture, religion so broadly that they end up meaning one and the same, then we end up losing the usefulness of the term. And even in ordinary language, we know there is something that distinguishes each of them. And so this ties back to my discussion in Law and Society. I earlier mentioned how one line of reasoning sees law as constitutive of social reality, which blurs the line between the legal and the social. However, amongst socio-legal scholars, there is a lively debate as to whether this is the correct approach. Many scholars still prefer the view that various domains should be viewed as analytically separate. The reasoning is as follows. If we start with the more restricted understandings of categories like Islam, religion, and law, and we keep in mind the objectives that we seek to attain through those terms, then we end up being better able to gauge how these terms may be co-constitutive or in competition with one another. And so then I'll end off with one final thought, applicable to the use of analytical categories, both for Shahab Ahmad and within socio-legal scholarship. Perhaps what needs greater attention is the way in which we use concepts to understand the world. A number of social theorists argue that categories should not be viewed as providing a clear depiction of the social world. Rather, such categories point to the mere theoretical possibility of what may or may not exist in the world. Now, once we fail to capture the full depth of human experiences, then we can enter the truly rich process of explaining these variations. Thus, by loosening up a bit on our persistence for strict analytical clarity, we may end up with the most meaningful engagement of the questions before us. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for this invitation. I've found the book to be, and the discussions earlier on, to be really interesting and really exciting, even though I come from a disciplinary base where the concerns are very different. So I'm a political theorist. I'm based in a department of political science, or political economy to be precise. And the larger questions or the debates in some ways are quite differently defined. So it was very interesting for me to actually hear some of the concerns that this book raised for others. For me, one of the key strengths of the book is the emphasis on contradiction. And I will, for most of my presentation today, I will actually talk about the place of contradiction and its relationship with the capaciousness of a tradition that Shahab Ahmad seems to emphasize, and that to me is a very interesting line of inquiry. But I should place my own work a bit so that you can make sense of the comments that I make. So I'm interested in, and I am one of the organizers for UK level subdiscipline that's emerging, which is comparative political theory. Comparative political theory takes seriously ideas and practices from other parts of the world to generate theoretical insights, theoretical frameworks, generalizable categories and frameworks. So when I look at Islamic political thought, I'm not thinking of Islamic political thought as something that is meaningful only for Muslims, or it is a means only to understand Muslims and Islam, but Islamic political thought as providing resources for understanding the bigger questions today, for resources for Muslims and non-Muslims to think about, to understand social and political life today, to think about questions of what makes a good life, etc. So in a sense, it is the reversal of the Eurocentric gaze. Islam is no longer the object of study. Islam provides the resources for generating new theoretical insights and new ways of thinking about theory. So with that in the background, I found this book to be raising some very useful ideas and resources to help us think about particularly questions about liberalism more generally today, and to think through the cracks and fissures in liberalism. What is Islam? Is a question that is asked in the title, and we heard that it's not a title that Shahab Ahmad would have necessarily chosen for himself, but it is a question that is being asked today by not just those who are Muslim or security experts or newspaper columnists who want to understand what is Islam, but also many Muslims around the world. It's a fundamental questioning of what precisely it means to be Muslim today. How exactly are Muslims to relate to this thing called Islam? And how are they to conceptualize Islam and its place in their lives, given the wild contradictions between Islamic law, the longer Islamic history, and their own local practices? And I have argued elsewhere that this rethinking, this critical conceptual engagement with Islam, with its place in Muslim life, is actually a fundamental transformation in the modern world, and it's a question that Shahab Ahmad, I think, asks and is meaningful because of that context. So in some ways, when Rob says that Shahab's work could not have been possible without Wahhabism in the background, Shahab's question would not have been meaningful also without modernity in the background, without this kind of transformation in how Muslims relate to Islam in the background. It's a question then which is not just for people in the Islamic studies domain. It's not just a question for the security experts. It's also a question that many Muslims are asking themselves. And I think towards the end, I'd like to come to why many Muslims may be asking this question in this particular way. So the answer that Shahab provides in this excellent book is masterful in bringing together a wide-ranging array of material. And it is a book that goes back and forth in terms of who it speaks to. It speaks to Islamic studies, academic world. It speaks to people who are outside of Islamic studies. And it also seems at times to be speaking to Muslims more generally. And this, I think, is Shuruk's point about his positionality. He positions himself in a particular way of being, and he is responding to other ways of being Muslim at the same time. And obviously, this is a bit of a problem as well, because we're not sure at various points who exactly is he speaking to, but he's trying to address these very wide range of audiences. So the key idea I want to explore more with and through Shahab's book is the idea of contradiction within Islam. So he asks, why, if wine drinking is frowned upon in the text, the Holy Quran, have Muslims been drinking it throughout their history? Why did the Emperor Jahangir have coins minted with his image holding a glass of wine, which is on the cover of the book? If that is not a public statement of some kind, then we don't know what would be, right? He has a coin minted with him holding a glass of wine. Why is homoerotic love and longing celebrated in Islamic poetry and representational arts? Why are definitions of halal and haram so malleable in practice if the law is quite clear about it in the text? So these are some questions that Shahab raises. And in his answers to these questions, Shahab Ahmed seems to address both the academic audience, particularly in his discipline of Islamic studies, but also Muslims, particularly in what he calls the Bengal Two Balkans complex. And as I said, there are multiple interlocutors here, and it's not clear who's being addressed. But he criticizes the excessive focus on law and jurisprudence within the discipline, in part because these discussions are available in ready textual format. Academics have tended to depend upon them to define Islam. However, these textual discussions by jurists provided only one somewhat narrow window into a much wider vista. And I won't go into the details of this discussion because it's already been had. But if textual resources are convenient, then akhlaq and adab literature, ethical norms of rulership, practices for everyday life, and embedded visions of the good life were fundamental in allowing a wide flexibility that allowed a diverse range of people to think of themselves and their way of life. This seems to be, to me, the core of his argument. This does not, he also wants to say, even though there's a whole range of diverse ways of being Muslim, it doesn't translate into complete randomness, because all of this is held together by the centrality of Quran, by shared conceptual frameworks and ideational languages. And I won't go into the pretext, context, and text, because some of those limitations have been raised. But I think just in substantive terms, the material that he lays out for me in the book speaks to me of this shared conceptual frameworks and ideational languages. Now, the line between a fundamental contradiction that will trip a way of life, trip a tradition into obsolescence, and capaciousness of tradition is a very delicate one. How do you decide when the contradiction is too much? When is a contradiction so dramatic or so fundamental that it is no longer part of the same tradition? But then how do we think of a tradition without understanding and engaging with the capaciousness of it as well? So the idea that a tradition has to be internally logical, coherent, free of contradictions is obviously the problem. Shahab Ahmed's argument seems convincing to me in terms of wanting to bring in that contradiction, make it explicit, make it central to our understanding of Islam. It seems convincing to me because I too have been trying to work through that particular calibration that drawing such a line between contradiction and capaciousness might entail. A capacious tradition, intellectual, political, and social tradition, will hold room for significant contradiction. It will allow variation and modification. So in terms of ideas, if we think about political thought as a discipline, in terms of ideas, the collections of ideas that do not allow contradiction, that do not allow internal contradictions are called ideologies. Ideologies they tend to be much more coherent, they tend to be more rational, they are free of internal contradictions. But an ideology is not the same as a vibrant, living tradition. One way to think about this is that liberalism as an ideology is an ideology, but is an ideology that people don't think of as an ideology. Its contradictions, its internal contradictions have been held in enough tension to allow it life and yet not complete collapse. Communism, on the other hand, is an ideology that is much more rational, but its thrust towards rationality made the living within that framework much harder. So erasion of contradictions within Islam is a modernist project, and one that Islamist, not necessarily Islamic, but Islamist thought that I study is particularly committed to. The challenge for contemporary Muslims is to think about how to incorporate that capaciousness back into their life if they've lost it. And so that goes back to another question that Rob raised, which is, why do contemporary Muslims, so academics, if the legal theorists or Islamic studies people, I say people, I'm sorry, it's just because it's a different word slightly to me. But if academics in the Islamic studies world, have been giving law much more fundamental importance, why do ordinary Muslims do that? Why is this a problem that ordinary Muslims are also having to engage with and think about? How to, in a sense, Shahab Ahmed is asking, how do we stop making Islam into an ideology? How do we prevent that from happening? And a question that he doesn't ask, but the resources that he provides in this book allow me to ask, is whether a capacious norm of life even possible, given the increasing narrowing within all social and political life, including liberalism. Can Muslims continue to live immensely diverse lives as Muslims under the structures of the modern state? Before we go on trying to provide an answer that is worth before we try to move on to providing an answer, it's worth pausing to think about how and why ordinary Muslim lives have been impacted by this narrowing. From Shahab, we have an explanation for why academics focus on law and jurisprudence, but why did the millions of ordinary Muslims also start placing this emphasis on law? Much as we academics would like to think that our debates have an impact on social life, if anything, we are playing catch up. So, we are responding, they are not responding to our concerns, we are responding to the concerns of society outside. So why did ordinary Muslims start placing this emphasis on Sharia as law rather than as a broader normative framework, rather than other understandings of Sharia? An important part of the answer to that question has to rest on the emergence of the modern state and the dominance of liberalism, which is ultimately an immensely legalistic framework. And again, Nafe just mentioned how law has moved from being about regulation more generally to being a discourse that permeates social and political life today. So modern states require for their functioning a homogenized legal framework, ideally homogenized polities and homogenized imaginations. So the vision of Islam that Shahab Ahmed articulates is at the same time imperiled, but also very exciting. It's exciting because it helps us think about forms of life that embrace contradiction and contention as internal and constitutive of it. And I think, to me, that fundamentally is the main contribution. This idea that this contradiction is internal and constitutive of Islam is a very productive idea that one can then work with and raise a whole host of other questions. And so I'd just like to finish by saying that, again, one of my broader concerns is the decolonization of knowledge production and consumption. And this decolonization of knowledge production and consumption cannot proceed if we continue to use the same categories that carry the burden of a very specific historical experience, of European historical experience. So that opening up of categories has to proceed hand in hand with a kind of a broad sweep of history, as well as this kind of analytical questioning. So I heard with a lot of interest some of the questions that were raised about how his vision of history is static, Shahab's vision of history static. And I think that it may be static in the sense that it is not necessarily looking at changes within the wider kind of Islamic society, but it is productive in looking at what is common and what is stable within those wider Islamic, within the Balkans to Bengal context. And to that extent, it serves a very important analytical purpose to not think about the change, but to think about what is common. These are choices that are methodological choices that he has made. But to me, they have been very generative in opening up particular ways of thinking about what might be a different way of thinking about tradition more broadly, not just Islam, but the capaciousness that any tradition, intellectual, social, and political tradition, may engender and may require for its vitality. Thank you very much.
So we have about 20 minutes or more for questions. So, any from the audience? Oh, sorry.
Thank you to all speakers. All three presentations were really insightful. I've enjoyed them very much. I have a question to Humaira about contradiction. You talked about trying to link Shahab's endeavor to modernity. As I was reading the book, it's doing a lot of things. It could be read decolonially, but it could also be read as colonizing certain aspects of the Muslim experience of, historical B2B. Contradiction is not necessarily, in my reading of how these opposites that he uses, Zahir Batin, for example, have been read in the exegetical text. They are not necessarily seen as contradictions. The dissimilarity could be noted, but they are not. The logic is not opposition. The logic operates on the continuum. It is only because these are layers, and he himself talks of the layers of truth. So, that kind of the construction. I agree that the whole book is a construction, a deconstruction, a construction in ways, and a reconstruction. So all of it has to be read as an account, an interpretive account. It can't be read as a historical truth. So including contradiction.
Thank you. That's very useful because it also allows me to, expand upon an aspect of the book. My suggestion is not that Shahab Ahmed is setting out to do what I want him to do or what I'm setting out to do. So my suggestion is not that he too is interested in decolonizing thought. And I took your point earlier as well, both about gender and about a certain kind of reification that is part of his writing. And I think Rob has already actually made this point about how he is taking some of these things as contradictions that would not have been, in that context, would not have been seen as contradictions. So I completely take that point. I think that but if we are thinking about today and how we are to define any religion and then define our understanding of Islam, then what is defined as contradiction today? We need to actually, this is what the book does for us, explicitly saying, this may be, this is how people think of this is a contradiction, and it is not a contradiction. But these are seemingly, these are ideas that are nevertheless on different different ends of the same spectrum. Right? Even then, there is that difference. The range of difference that is internal to the tradition is much wider than we would imagine otherwise. So I take your point, and I think you're right that it may require greater analytical work to define whether this, to think of this as contradiction, whether we also define it as contradiction or not. Yeah, I think that will take me some more time to think through this, but I appreciate Shahab's effort to open up the range of what we would see as constitutive of that wide equilibrium.
Thank you very much for this excellent conference. Rob, I think your points were spot on, and it just seems to me when I read the book some time back, Shabab himself, who went to school in Britain, maybe it was a product of the Islamic activities in late 1990s, 80s, and it just seems to me, I don't think he actually studied Sharia or any legal tradition thoroughly with any traditional ulama, in some sense. Otherwise, one wouldn't be making a lot of these statements as he would do in his book, which has its points from a historical perspective, fine. At the same time, there seems to be a lot of angst. And I work in the community, I have some institutions. While it has its place, from an anthropological, historical perspective, I can definitely tell you that, someone wearing, going and talking about liqueur and wine, coming from an Islamic intellectual perspective, it is still problematic. It's not about Islamic hurt, it's not about the Muslim community being very stupid. It's actually a conscious decision, because I think we underplay the importance of, tarbiyah, people taking agency of themselves to learn and become more spiritual. So sometimes academics sort of delude themselves, thinking that, with all due respect, thinking that they're actually, it could, as you correctly said, he's a response to, probably Wahhabism. He's a product of modernity. He's a product of modernity. He's a product of the Muslim world failing. So I wouldn't, take some things positively, his own journey, but I wouldn't take me personally, who study with traditional ulama and work with some academics, I wouldn't take the whole package as it's a thinking tool, but I wouldn't say, what is Islam? Because I do have a problem with if someone said, what is Islamic or what is Islam? And at the beginning of the conference, he said, he's trying to define, is he trying to create a new orthodoxy? He's not happy with the current orthodoxy. Well, that's not going to change.
But we can take other questions if there are other questions. If there's not,
I don't know if this actually
sort of building off a similar strain of what the gentleman was just talking about, it's sort of a common theme throughout today of Orientalism on the one hand and Salafism and the sort of new Wahhabi brand is symbiotic and two opposites working against each other. And then Shahab's book sort of trying to look before that for a new framework which potentially can be brought into the modern sphere to address issues that we face. So I wondered whether we also, whilst dealing with the intellectual sphere, need to consider how much of the debate and the conversation we're having today is geopolitically contingent on where the centers of power are and where the power and who shapes the political thought in Islam today rests.
responses.
Well, I suppose I can throw a couple of things in because these are interesting comments about do we have a responsibility as scholars to put forward frameworks which will change the way in which society views Muslims, sees them in a less monodimensional way? You know, is this a responsibility as a scholar? I don't know whether Shahab Ahmed would feel that responsibility as keenly as we do with the Prevent duty. So I don't know whether he would have done. Whether the effect of his, you know, if everyone read his book and everyone understood what he was saying, what would change? And that's a sort of a hypothetical question. But if we have a more pluralistic notion of what constitutes Islamic identity or what Islam might be, then we have then we might have a more productive debate nationally, at least in the UK. But part of me thinks that the book is not really about what is Islam, it's about what is Islamic. And in a sense, Princeton University Press could have equally called it what is Islamic. Because calling it what is Islam reifies this thing in a way which Shahab Ahmed wants to unreify it. So you ask what is Islam, you're saying you expect an answer to that which describes a thing. Whereas in fact a lot of what he's saying in the book is about process. And what he really seems to be worried about, particularly at the beginning, is how do we use the adjective Islamic? And this is one of the things which Yossi opened up with. How do we use the word Islamic? Not how do we use the word Islam, but how do we use the word Islamic to describe philosophy, and wine drinking, and looking at young boys, and writing poetry about it? And can we use the word Islamic for those things? And I think that is the thing which comes out of the book as perhaps the most methodologically significant thing that we can learn from it in terms of the field. He makes a few shortcuts and he's extremely good at producing statements which stick in your mind, and you know, the whole Balkans to Bengal conflict. I mean, this is inaccurate because he goes as far as Java, okay, and Java's not in Bengal on my globe, okay, so it's beyond Bengal, but the alliteration is too tempting for him, I think, and I think that's so. There's lots of things which you know you can unpick.
I think it's the Bay of Bengal.
Yeah, but even Java's round the corner, right? So he has a whole section on Joyce. Well, it's you know, okay. But he had an additional alliteration he missed. He could have said the Balkans to the Bay of Bengal. So he had a triple B complex. He missed a trick. So I think that sometimes he's in a sense he is creating something which challenges the field, but he's also creating a work of art.
Yes.
And I think that's one way of looking at this book. It's a thought experiment rather like an abstract painting. And for that reason you can say that it's beautiful, even if you don't like it.
It's interesting because he also talks about Southeast Asia as the new world of the Balkans to Bengal complex. So he is also recognizing that there is a difference in how these places relate to.
Yeah.
Are you going to?
Okay, just to quickly pick up on your point, because you mentioned how sometimes academic discourses aren't necessarily reflecting what's happening in the case that you mentioned, religious communities and the Muslim community, in fact. And these are processes that actually, transcend just religion. I mean, in my discipline of law, I mean, there's a lot of theorizing in law schools, what happens in the courts, but a lot of that doesn't really reflect what's happening in communities, not just Muslim, but like in the West, in the East, all across the board. So what's happening is that, and where Bach is not very well in her speech, what modernity has done, I don't want to essentialize the word modernity, but I'm not going to go into that. But what it's done is it's created, certain binaries in the way we think generally. And so academics, not just academics, but they are helpful in at least breaking that dichotomy, whether it's in Islamic studies, whether it's in law, whether it's in other disciplines, to see that there is plurality of possibilities and visions available. And so I think that's something that isn't even necessarily particular to Islamic studies, but a theme that comes from the book, but is applicable to many domains.
I'll be very quick. I think on the question of where is knowledge production, or is knowledge, what is the relationship between knowledge and power, is a bigger question. But just on the question of Islamic thought more generally, I think that in general, non-European political thought has been and is more creative since the late 19th, early 20th century. That is where the more creative thinking is going on. European thought in that sense is much more traditional. It relies much more on, the same kind of books, the same writers, the same kind of framing. Whereas Islamic thought, for instance, and Islamist thinking, so if I think of Joy Maududi, who I work upon, is immensely creative. They are bringing together very different bodies and literatures, very different ways of thinking, and trying to synthesize and move beyond. So in that sense, I mean, I don't have that kind of pessimism about the future of Islamic thought or Muslims more generally. I certainly think that actually non-European political thinking has been much more creative because it has engaged with European thinking as well as their own traditions. So if you're thinking of Chinese political thought so one of my colleagues at LSE who I convened this comparative political theory group with works on modern Chinese thought. If you think of South Asian thought, if you think about, say, Gandhi or Tagore or Maududi writing in similar kinds of periods, they are actually really bringing together a wider historical perspective, wider resources in terms of ideas and thoughts that they're bringing together and creatively synthesizing them. So I think that, that a very simplistic kind of understanding that if the world today is dominated by America, then all the best knowledge or most important knowledge is also produced there is problematic. And Islamic thought is interesting also because actually the mechanism for Islam, for knowledge production and consumption within the Muslim world has not been completely decimated. So ulama, madrasas, etc., they continue to function, and they continue to function somewhat as independent of state, which is again a source of violence.
It's a collective view, so and then Yossi.
Well, I just have a brief comment on the question of how the book relates to contemporary discussions on what is Islam and on Muslim identity. I think the book is clearly political. It's not purely historical, it has a political agenda. It wants to say basically that Islam is diverse and it encompasses things other than literalism, it's scripturalism, etc. So, yeah, I think this is quite clear in the book. But, and I think the author felt that this was a positive contribution to make. And I think in a way it is, but there's a danger in this line of argument, because this effectively re-emphasizes the old Orientalist view that Muslim societies are essentially religious, they're essentially Islamic. Everything in Muslim societies, in pre-modern Muslim societies, is Islamic. Art is Islamic, philosophy is Islamic, everything done, science is Islamic, everything is labeled Islamic art, etc., etc. And again, it just re-emphasizes this notion that Islam is hegemonic. It just encompasses everything and controls everything in pre-modern Muslim societies. So there is this danger, I think, and I think we should be mindful of this.
Can I this one?
I definitely see your point about the same. This would link to what I think there's a passage there that Shihab wrote with me in mind. You see some places where actually. So I wrote these pieces on, and others, as you said, many others. Islamic law in practice was not only the Sultan intervened in all sorts of ways. And I've done, and I was very happy. I've done that, I showed that, I was very happy. I felt that they are interest. But now Shihab comes and says, that's fine, great, but what is the ideological legitimacy? Yeah. What is the ideological legitimacy of the Sultan intervening in matters? How is it justified? What is the discourse for that? I haven't asked this question. I don't know, in fact, there are some people who ask that, but the articulating in any way. His answer is okay, he goes to ethical literature. I'm not convinced, whatever. The point is that for me, the answer to your question, Ayman, is because it is Islamic, but what perhaps is more important is the way he links all these different discourses together. So he wouldn't call it religious, and he doesn't call it religious. Because it is intertextual, this interdiscourse, he said, well, the reason the Sultan intervenes in fiqh is because the discourse on ethics is directly relevant, maybe art and maybe other things, but and then call it religion because it is Islamic. For him, it's not religious. So that's, I think, how to avoid the danger that you're absolutely right to point out.
Can I make a comment in relation to this?
We have one more question.
My response is to Rob. I do take your suggestion very seriously that Shahab is responding in the Wahhabi context, that he has bought into the Quran. But I would think that the Wahhabi context is not just a modern context. You know, the Ahl Quran, the kind of things they are trying to retrieve is also something that was very pure and pristine to the Prophet for them. So over 1,000 years of history, we have puritanical movements which keep coming up and subsiding, coming up and subsiding. So there is a dialectical relationship maybe between how Puritanism works and the way wine drinking and other things work, which Shahab is identifying. My problem with Shahab is that he, of course, identifies that there is a contradiction, but he doesn't really answer that why does that contradiction become acute in some times and not that acute in other times. Well, some people are comfortable with it, but we in modern times are not really comfortable. Not just Muslims, but also non-Muslims see it as a contradiction.
Sure.
Well,
Yeah, please.
so I just wanted to come back first on the question of whether, so in part, Yusuf has addressed that Islamic is not the same as religious. I guess one other way to think about it is if we think about the modernist assumptions that underpin a whole host of ideational constellations today. So with different kinds of ideologies or framings, ideational framings, liberalism, communism, they all share certain modernist assumptions and thus they are modern ideologies. Right? That is how I think of the Islamic in this context, that there's a certain normative horizon that defines the horizon. There's some certain normative framing that defines the horizon, that makes it an Islamic context. Within that, there is huge diversity. Within that, people will have different ways of thinking about the good life, different ways of philosophizing. So it doesn't have to be religious to be Islamic. And that, I think, is a fundamental point. Our definition of religion and wanting to think about Islamic as religious is heavily indebted to the European definition of religion, that needs conceptually to separate religion from the social and the political domain. And once we stop with that struggle, because human life seems to be constantly bleeding across these conceptual categories, right? We can't entirely contain even the state, society. I mean, I'm a political scientist, that's the main two categories that we work with. Where does state start and where does society end? Where is the limit of society? How do state and society, where do they stand in relation to each other? When we stop wanting to make human life fit within these compartments of social, political, economic, religious, then we have a better conception of how Islam and Islamic might operate. So I completely understand where you're coming from, but I would push back on the Eurocentric category that actually underlies that assumption that to call it Islamic is to call it religious at the same time.
Yes.
We'll let the panel respond.
Okay,
Yes.
the only thing I'll add to that, because I'll situate a comment within Humaira's comment, which is that even within the notion of categories that we have, and this is what I was trying to get at when we look at it from the legal perspective, these categories themselves are somewhat in a state of being reconstituted continually. And sometimes within Islamic studies, and especially within law, we get fixated on this idea of categories being definitive and not being able to have this co-constitutive aspect. So, I mean, that's the only thing I wanted to add in terms of what the legal domain sees in terms of its similarities with the Islamic studies domain.
Lots of interesting things, thank you. Yes, maybe in the field of Islamic legal studies we haven't taken into account the fact that very early on in the fiqh tradition there's a recognition of the limitations of the fuqaha. This is something which is built into the fiqh tradition at the early point, is that although they talk as if their discourse is a totalizing discourse which controls everything in society, this is the limits of the genre that they're writing in, that assumes that they're writing for an ideal world that doesn't exist. And I think they're writing obviously a set of regulations, but they're writing for an ideal world that doesn't really exist, and they know that it doesn't really exist. And I think that the fuqaha are, I think that to an extent in the book, they get the sticky end of the stick, because they don't actually have this totalizing vision to grab power in the way that sometimes comes through in the ways he describes what the jurisprudence are doing. They reckon, and not just the Hanafi tradition, which of course recognizes certain powers for the Sultan, and perhaps the Hanafi tradition is particularly identified with the Sultan's powers, but in all the traditions there's a recognition that some things we can't do them, but they still need to be done by someone, and it's still Islamic, and the Sultan does it. We may not be, in the case of homicide, the family may forgive the murderer. But that doesn't mean we just have murderers hanging around in society going scot-free. The Sultan has to intervene and do something about it, siyasatan. And that means that within the fiqh itself, and I think that Shahab Ahmed recognises that, and that point is well made, that within the fiqh itself there's a recognition of the limitations of the fuqaha. And so, I don't think he needs to go to the ethics and the Akhlaq-i-Nasiri and these other sources in order to demonstrate that. I think it's already present there. If he wants to exploit it, he doesn't. I don't think he wants to, but he wants to bring out the ethical tradition because it's Persian, because it's Persianate, and because it's linked in with literature and adab and all the other things which the Mirror for Princes stuff does.
It has a different kind of circulation, so I think it's
It has a different sort of circulation, but that may be part of it. But all of these writers, when they write, they're within a particular tradition of writing that has certain presumptions within it. And I take the point completely about whether or not the paradoxes are modern paradoxes or we've had them throughout history, and I think that's recognised that we have purification movements throughout history. But that they are paradoxes at this particular point in time is because we live in the times when Islam is defined in one way by a certain group, and everyone else has trouble defining Islam, which is different from that group's definition of Islam, because they don't have a strong set of logical arguments to say that Islam's different from that, because the logic of the Salafi argument is extremely compelling in the contemporary context, and we've seen that. And in a sense, the book maybe is too complicated a text to try and counter that. But I think that's partly what he's trying to do. And I come back to the notion that, of course, you miss out things like the gender question. And I've got a particular concern. A particular concern that he really aligns Islam with Sunni Islam. It's a continuous. I just took out one example, but throughout the text there's an elision between Islam and Sunni Islam, as if and if he'd have actually immersed himself in the Shiite tradition, he would have realised that the pretext-text distinction that he makes is broken down within Shiism in terms of philosophical understandings of the law. in a much more explicit and detailed way than he gives the jurisprudence credit for. So my concerns are that if we just take this as a blueprint for the future of Islamic legal studies, we might be missing some tricks. But if we take it as a wake-up call to do some serious thinking about how we use terms in our scholarship, then I think it's a really useful contribution.
Very brief. But that was kind of a nice summary.
Sure. So I'm not advocating a simplistic account of religion or anything of the sort. But if we leave the word religion aside, let's focus on the word Islamic, because this is what the book is about. And if you consider pretext, these concepts, pretext and text, these are defined in terms of revelation. So that's what I'm talking about. It's if the idea, if the notion that pre-modern Muslim societies were revelation-centric, let's say, leave the word religion aside, I think they're in that's very dangerous because again, it's the same old Orientalist notion, only expressed in different terms. Everything's Islamic, whether you define the word Islamic as in terms of religion or revelation, it's still more or less, we're talking about the same thing.
And it's also, in a sense, part of the same discourse that the Salafis want to promote, which is the whole of society has to be Islamic. Traffic lights, sewage systems, mugs and cups, as Sharuk said, they all have to be Islamic in some ways. And that totalizing discourse, which you find in Salafism, is in a sense, the flip side of it is replicated in the book.
Exactly. I was going to make that point, is that the whole book is actually, as Ayman said, as well as having the theoretical ontological, it also has the political substratum, which is trying to counter fundamentalizing discourses. So the Wahhabis, the Orientalists, everyone who's trying to fundamentalize Islam one way or another is encountered with that book. A point in response to you, Mizan, I think Shahab Ahmad understood some aspects of Islamic law, I'm sure. He understood tafsir quite well and rhetoric, and I've read some of his work on that. But the exclusion was deliberate, only because, as he says, it might be construed as recentering Islam around these fundamental texts. He's not saying that they are not there, they are there in his book. He's just not conceptually and theoretically acknowledging it in the way that I would have expected. But he wants to do the opposite, to say that the Islamic is actually not restrictive, it's open for productive, positive, fruitful ways of living and thinking that go beyond your notion as a leader, whether scholar or Muslim or a event officer, for that matter, your notion as a leader of the restrictive Islamic. So he's opening it up in order to avoid the dangers. So, and I would think that not everything is Islamic, only those things which become normative in Muslim experience and practice.
Or he's trying to create new orthodoxy.
Sorry?
Or he's trying to promote a new orthodoxy.
No, I leave it there.
I think we are kind of spilling into the coffee break, but was there any last comments you want to make?
You don't want to spill into the coffee break.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panel again.